you know, for many of us, when growing up, the Sunday funnies were always a highlight of any weekend. Well, a new
you can lift it.
coffee table book has details about the history of those comics.
Yeah, this is like the anti-comic. It weighs like 60 pounds.
Yeah,
this book was written by artist Brian Walker, and our Poco Maestro, of course, Barry Mitchell, sat down with him to talk about this book.
Dick Tracy, probably not the first detective in the comics, but certainly the most famous. Started in 1931 by Chester Gould. It was kind of a response to the mob violence in Chicago.
Comic strips have been part of our lives for over 100 years. And Brian Walker, cartoonist and historian, has compiled The Comics, the complete collection, published by Abrams Comic Arts. Brian, what do you think was the first significant newspaper comic strip?
Well, that would be The Yellow Kid, who first appeared in 1895. They used it to sell newspapers in the beginning, and it worked, and the rest is history.
Was there a golden age of comic strips?
In my opinion, I think the 20s might have been the golden age, when there was a lot of interesting things going on in terms of storytelling in the comics. Barney Google, Little Orphan Annie, Moon Mullins. Moon Mullins was my grandfather's favorite strip. My grandfather used to read this to my father when he was a little boy, and he would laugh so hard that tears would come out of his eyes.
Wow.
And that's what made my father want to be a cartoonist.
Your dad, of course, is Mort Walker, the creator of
Beetle Bailey and High and Lois.
And he's how old now?
87.
And he still draws.
He's still drawing Beetle Bailey. I'm part of the creative team that produces both of those strips. I write the gags, but actually draw them. They're little, like, sort of storyboard sketches.
What was it like growing up in a household with a cartoonist for a dad?
You know, it's funny, I just took it for granted. I just thought that this was normal, that, you know, fathers worked at home. John Cullen Murphy, who drew Prince Valiant, was my godfather, and Dick Brown, who drew Hagar the Horrible, performed my wedding ceremony.
Do comic strips get a bad rap? Are they considered the poor relation of the art world?
Oh, definitely. I don't think cartoons, comic strips are the same as fine art, but I think that that's what books like mine are about. Helping people learn to appreciate comics as something more than just sort of a passing fancy. These are some of the most beautifully illustrated story adventure strips ever done, I think. Rip Kirby. Alex Raymond, in the early years of this strip, experimented with a lot of different techniques and alternating back and forth between very sort of delicate pen lines and very bold kind of brush strokes.
What are the most important strips of the last, say, 20 years?
There are 3 strips that came up in the 1980s. It was Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson, which in my mind is probably one of the best strips ever. There was another panel called Far Side, which some of you might remember,
sure,
by Gary Larson, just consistently hilarious on a daily basis. And the third cartoon is Burke Breathitt's Bloom County, which started as kind of a Doonesbury imitation, but it took off in his own direction.
Is there an up-and-comer that we should keep an eye out for?
Well, the cartoonist that all the other cartoonists are talking about is Richard Thompson, who does a wonderful strip called Cul-de-sac, about a little girl who goes to a preschool.
So, you know, I read somewhere that people under age 40 no longer read a newspaper regularly. What happens to comic strips?
Well, I think there's no question that newspapers are in a very challenging period right now financially, and they've lost a lot of their business to the internet. So the fate of newspaper comics is certainly tied to the fate of newspapers, and whether that's going to end up on an iPad or on a phone or you know, in goggles that you wear around or something like that, who knows? But I think that there will always be comics. There will all be, because, you know, it's a form of expression of combining words and pictures together. And there are now, you know, very successful web comics. There's a lot of career paths.
Comic strips can survive without newspapers?
I think so. Yeah, definitely.
Barney Google with his googly eyes.
This is really a trip down memory lane, almost an encyclopedia of comics. We just want to give a shout out to Calvin and Hobbes.
We love Calvin and Hobbes.
And if you notice with this one, there are actually no words. It's just
them dancing.
Images, which the images themselves can be so powerful.
But that's how wonderful and creative the drawing is, that you really can kind of imagine it. That was a great comic strip.
They really are the unsung hero of the art world. All right.
They are. Coming up, who's rooting for a, hey, check that out.
I think that's us.